This is Duke University.
All black, everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined today by Ericka Blount Danois, an award-winning journalist, a professor at the Philip Merrill School of Journalism at the University of Maryland, and the author of the new book, Love, Peace, and Soul, Behind the Scenes of America's Favorite Dance Show, Soultrain, Classic Moments. How are you doing today, Ericka?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Mark.
So I think if you were to take a survey of Black America and ask them what is the program that they love the most, I think inevitably 75% of the folks will say Soul Train. And so in that regard, you know, writing a book about Soul Train was an obvious choice. But why did you write a book about Soul Train?
Yeah, it's funny. I spoke to students a little bit earlier today, and they're born in the 1990s, and even they know about Soul Train. They think of it as fun. But it actually started because I was searching for some of the dancers from the show, sort of like where are they now? And it was just supposed to be fun and funny, and particularly looking for Cheryl Song, who was the Asian dancer on the show. So I found her. I found her. She was working in LA at the airport, and she's not dancing anymore, but she's definitely has Soul Train memories. And she had also danced on Rick James and on a video on Rick James and Michael Jackson's Beat It, etc. Things I didn't know about her. And so, I started doing more research and trying to find other people. And I had also ordered the best of the DVDs. Right. So this is around Thanksgiving. So my whole family was waiting, like they were ready to watch all of the DVDs. And a colleague of mine, I was teaching at Morgan State at the time. He was like, "Oh, I want to borrow them. I want to see." His name is Todd Stephen Burroughs. And so, we were kind of like going back and forth, like bartering, like who's going to take which DVD. And we're like, maybe there's something else to it. And so the more research I did, the more I found out all of this history about Soul Train that I had no idea about. And that, the show, to start, that it was the longest running, first run syndicated show in history, and all the people that came out of it, from the dancers to, the people from the radio, people that had, started at WVON. And, so it's just this incredibly rich history that I didn't know.
I mean, for all the good memories and fun entertainment that we think about for Soul Train, I mean, Soul Train was really a serious and is a serious artifact of a particular historical moment. And of course, the centerpiece of that history is Don Cornelius, who was an incredibly, on the one hand, innovative, but also very complex figure. Talk a little bit about, what you found out about Don Cornelius, what was revealed to you about Don Cornelius, as you worked on this book.
Yes. I mean, to be able to survive as long as he did in the climate, and particularly during the time period that he started out, he had to be a very complicated person. And what I found out is that was true. At the time I had gotten the contract, it was 3 or 4 months later that he had committed suicide. And so, I had talked to some people, but, and I had met him, but did not have a chance to interview him in depth. And, I found even more difficult to get the truth from people after he died and the way that he died, that he committed suicide. But I found out a lot of people didn't like him. I found out that he was a really, private person. But I found out, overall, his bigger agenda was to employ, Black people on the set. It was to have, this cultural show that, people from around the world could enjoy. And, he rubbed people the wrong way a lot in making that happen. And so, there were people that, were not very fond of him. He had cursed people out. He fired, even his own son. A couple of times he had fired, Tony, on the show. He had cursed out, Snoop when he came on, who was high, he was like, get these N words off the show. Like, he was, and I had always pictured him, from watching him on the show as this kind of cool, real
smooth operator. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Interviewing people and, I found out that, he was cursing and even when I saw him when I went to Chicago, he was on a panel and he was, using a lot of.
I mean, you write about that in the beginning of the book. I mean, it was almost shocking to you, right? That this man that you had kind of, had these ideas about, all over these years. I mean, he opens his mouth, it's like, oh, damn. Right? It's like...
he's like a gangster.
I mean, but when you think about that for a second, I mean, do you think that really is a product of the historical moment where he comes through, where he really has to be pretty hardcore in terms of folks really understanding what his vision was?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and in fact, it was endearing because he sort of seems like this iconic figure that you could not touch. And to see him be, sort of this regular person that's, could go back and forth with the audience and, use 4-letter words. And it was actually a bit of like a relief to see that, oh, okay, he is one of us. And so, yeah, I think definitely he had to maintain this tough exterior to even survive, a couple of years, let alone 40 years that the show survived. So...
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony, your host. We're joined today by Ericka Blount Danois, author of the new book, Love, Peace, and Soul, Behind the Scenes of America's Favorite Dance Show, Soultrain Classic Moments. Was there anything in your research that surprised you? I mean, just stuff that was like off the chart that you just would have never expected, either about Don Cornelius or the show itself?
Nothing that I could tell you that I would not fear in my life. No,
Okay.
There were a lot of stories, particularly that came from the dancers that, wild parties, things that happened at those parties. So that kind of stuff. Yeah, definitely. And then, but I mean, more, I guess, G-rated. The dancers. I didn't know a lot of the stories that came out of the dancers because they, haven't, they've sort of been under the radar in terms of their stories being told. So, like Demeter Joe Freeman, who danced with Joe Tex and danced with James Brown on the show. Like she had jumped on the stage. Don didn't want her to jump on the stage, but she jumped on the stage.
Anyway, yeah.
Exactly. And, she ended up being like, she danced for the Queen of England. She danced, alongside like, Rudolph Nureyev. Like, she became a big deal and movie star too. I mean, not star, but she was in movies. And, for Rerun had auditioned for this role.
Fred Berry, yeah.
Yeah, Fred Berry. Right. Fred Berry. They called him Fred, Mr. Penguin Berry. So Shabba-Doo, from Breaking.
Right.
Yeah, so Shabba-Doo, he and Shabba-Doo went to the audition for What's Happening. And Shabba-Doo was supposed to play, the character that Rerun ended up.
Right.
It's supposed to be, it's based on Cooley High, so it's supposed to be Cochise. And so, Fred Berry was this really funny and actually a ladies' man. Like, he was a good dancer and people, like he was more of a ladies' man even than Shabba-Doo, who, whatever, it's the pretty boy type. So anyway, so he came into the audition and he just wowed the producers. He, and it was really Shabba-Doo who was coming to audition, but Fred Berry came there to accompany him and ended up auditioning and stealing the role from him. So, little side stories about, the dancers and some of the artists. I talked to maybe 80, 90 artists that had been on the show. So a lot of funny stories that, came out of, what happened behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
Yes.
Yeah, about a year ago on Left of Black, we had Matthew Delmont on the show, and Matthew had just written this interesting book about Race Philadelphia and of course American Bandstand. Can you talk a little bit about some of the tensions, between Dick Clark and Don Cornelius, and particularly when Soul Train starts to take off and really have success?
Yeah, so I guess you may know about the show Soul Unlimited that Dick Clark started in 1973 to rival Soul Train. But before that, even in Chicago, when the Chicago local version, Dick Clark had apparently taken him out to lunch and tried to buy the local version of the show because he knew like he was missing.
Right.
It's a whole world of music. The dancers were incredible, the fashion, it was colorful, and it was a moneymaker. And so, Don refused. And that was another big thing I didn't know that Don had owned the show as well, and he had owned it early on. But anyway, so, yeah, I mean, there was, later on, when he started Soul Unlimited, there was a lot of tension and a lot of four-letter words coming from Dick Clark, who is kind of the poster boy for, good clean cut image and,
that generation's Ryan Seacrest, right?
Exactly. And he very much was not. And so, he called at one point, I can't remember the exact quote, but he called him essentially the show and the way that they were going about trying to save the show from this competition, that they were being ghetto pretty much. And, so Clarence Avant, Jesse Jackson, and Don, they started this campaign to get Soul Unlimited, which had a host, Buster Jones. It's not quite as cool as, but they were on a network, and Don was syndicating, so he was syndicated. So he was having to get stations to air the program, whereas the network was,
carrying it, right?
Exactly. And so, they started this campaign to get them off, and, eventually they had to bow out because it was, so obvious what they were doing. And, Buster was not as electrifying as Don, and
I would imagine, having seen some of the clips of Buster Jones, that there are probably a few folks who might even read him as a bit of a sellout in 1973, particularly in comparison to Don Cornelius, right?
Exactly.
We're here with Ericka Blount Danois, author of the new book, Love, Peace, and Soul, behind the scenes of America's favorite dance show, Soul Train, Classic Moments. What do you think, when all is said and done, is the most lasting legacy of Soul Train, and even Don Cornelius in that context?
I think definitely the show, the cultural impact is just, it's hard to even to define because, it's bootlegged in Japan, it's all over Brazil. But I think, he paved the way for everybody that's here today, from Bob Johnson's BET to Oprah to Tyler Perry. None of these networks, Black-oriented networks, could exist without Soul Train. And, musically, it still airs. Like, people still watch it. It's still on Centric. It's still on BET. It's still on Aspire. Like, when it comes on, I watch it, Other people watch it. My kids watch it. Like, it's, it's still the music at the time. And, throughout the show, he put the best of the best on the show. So the music endures. Like, the music always comes first. The music represents what's happening in the culture. And he realized that. And he put the best, white, Black, mid-level artists, superstars, all of it. He had this clinic on, diversity, so he set the stage for what all the other shows were missing.
You have a favorite Soul Train moment, Ericka?
I have lots of them. my favorite is, Al Green with the broken arm. Like, it's electrifying. Like, you can't look away. But, there are other funny moments. Richard Pryor hosting the show. He let Richard Pryor do whatever he wanted to do. The whole episode, which was crazy, but it worked. And, there's Cheech and Chong is on there. Seeing Reverend Al Sharpton.
Right. As a teenager, yeah. He
has the exact same voice.
And hair.
Like he had to be a preacher. There was no way. There's so many moments. Like every time it's on, I have to watch it, and I see something else that I missed before. I'm
gonna be bad because my favorite Soul Train moment is the Honeycomb performing ads and the lead singer Edna, who was this red bone, blonde hair, and she's wearing this little sheer top. That's like I just love that episode.
Well, all the guys I talked to all had a favorite dancer. That was their first thing that they talked about. Yeah, the Honeycomb, and that was an excellent show. The first show. That was the first show.
Yeah.
In LA. Yeah.
We've been joined today by Ericka Blount Danois, an award-winning journalist, professor at the Philip Merrill School of Journalism at the University of Maryland, the author of the new book just published, Love, Peace, and Soul, Behind the Scenes of America's Favorite Dance Show, Soul Train, Classic Moments. Thanks for joining us, Ericka.
Thank you for having me. I had a good time. Thank you.
You're welcome. Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined via Skype today by Devorah Heitner, who's the author of the new book, Black Power TV, Duke University Press. How are you doing today, Devorah?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
So this is really an amazing book that brings together the kind of last moments of the Black Power movement and this sudden interest around public television. They kind of intersect in this particular moment. In your book is really a study of these 4 shows, coming out of 4 very different perspectives that really give us a way to think about these early moments of a Black presence on television. So talk a little bit about your interest in this subject and how you got to Black Power TV.
Sure. So I had written about the anti-racist curriculum of Sesame Street, which is, of course, an early public television show. Very early on in my graduate work in media technology and society. And I started just looking at 60s and 70s television and meeting more African-American media workers who were involved with getting into TV at that time. And Martha Biondi, who I worked with at Northwestern, said, you should have a look at Inside Bedford-Stuyvesant and Like It Is. And I said, oh, okay. And so, I'm from New York. I went home to visit my family and went up to the Schomburg and checked out those shows and just sat in the archive for hours. I watched, I think, every episode of Like It Is and Black Journal that they had. And then I went downtown to the Museum of TV and Radio to see Inside Bedford-Stuyvesant. And I immediately knew that this was just an incredible history, and that someone needed to write about this very soon, because a lot of the workers and producers and creators who made these programs were still active in the industry, but some of them were already
moved on.
Getting older, retiring. Some of them had passed away. And so I just recognized that there was a really important story that needed to be told. And it just kept on surprising me the entire time that I was researching this book, which really ended up being almost 10 years of my life. I never stopped being surprised by the stories that people told me who were involved with this era. I never stopped meeting people who everywhere I went where I told folks that I was working on this, many times I would just meet people in social settings, and they would say, oh, I was on that show. I'm based here in Chicago, and there are several shows in Chicago that I didn't get to write in great detail about because the shows themselves were lost. And as a media person, I would only really write about shows that I could actually see myself.
Right.
But I still learned a lot from talking to people, even about some of those lost shows from here in Chicago, from Detroit and other places, and what it meant to them to be on these shows, how they felt as audience members. And it just, it got me really excited about the idea for media to be a transformational experience for folks in communities that were marginalized. And yeah, I couldn't resist the programs themselves. And I'm a 70s baby, so I also just really recognized the aesthetic, and I got very excited about that.
Well, let me tell you, one of the reasons why Black Power TV resonates for me, and particularly in relationship to Left of Black, I grew up in New York City watching shows like Positively Black, like it is, Black Journal, both the initial iteration, but of course Tony Brown's iteration going forward. And in a lot of ways, I see Left of Black as a direct correlation, a legacy of those kind of television shows. I mean, I had no sense of Black talk, for instance, on television without having the opportunity to watch Gil Noble all those years, in New York City. And so when you talk about some of these shows, I mean, they're all coming from different perspectives. Some of them are nationally syndicated, some of them are locally based. And to start with Inside Bed-Stuy, which itself becomes a kind of interesting moment in television because of one of the co-hosts, Roxy Roker, who we all get to know in our living room throughout the 70s and the 80s on the Jeffersons, mother of Lenny Kravitz. But talk about the beginning of that show, particularly its relationship to federal government interest, in terms of building communities.
Absolutely. So that show was a very interesting show because unlike all the other shows that I write about really come out of this moment, this crisis moment after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And that show was actually in the planning stages and even airing on television before King was assassinated. So it doesn't come out of that same crisis. It comes out of the Restoration Corporation. And the one in Bedford-Stuyvesant, the Bedford-Stuyvesant Development Corporation, was one of the very first ones. And this came out of, Kennedy's visit to the neighborhood, and there were all of these kinds of walkthroughs going on. Bedford-Stuyvesant was infamous. Media all over the country used Bedford-Stuyvesant as an example of ghetto. So it was really the beginning of what Robin Kelly calls ghettoizing discourses, right? So this is, a place where poverty is on display in this very lurid kind of way, and the Restoration
Bed-Stuy, do or die, right?
Yeah. And the Restoration Corporation was about bringing economic development to the neighborhood, and the show was supposed to showcase some of the great architecture and inherent resources that were already there, as well as the new projects. So it really is a very different a different impetus than the other shows that come out of the crisis of the King assassination. It's really a show that was about showcasing this community, and it becomes much more than that, right? The show, I mean, we see Roxy Roker and Jim Lowry, the two hosts, transform over the seasons of the program, which is an incredible thing to watch. That Roker really came out of a civil rights milieu and not a Black Power community, but she's open-minded. And what's amazing about these shows is you see the generations interact, and generations in this era, could be the difference between graduating from Howard, in the early 60s versus the mid 60s. So I'm not even talking about a full generation really, but just these different moments in activist attitude and perspective. But Roker and Lowry are both very open to the young activists that they meet. They meet people from the Black Panther Party. They meet activists who, coming out of experiences of resisting Vietnam, are anti-war activists. And they engage with these people at a very deep level, at a very human level, at a very friendly level. And in this way of, I just want to understand everything that's going on with you. And that wasn't necessarily the intention of the Restoration Corporation. Right. So Lowry, coming out of the Restoration Corporation, and he's still in corporations today. When I met with him to interview him for my book, he was in his huge office at, the Boston Consulting Group. So this is someone who's had a lifelong career in business. Right. Very interesting man. And, coming out of Peace Corps, as a lot of activists did also at that time. So it was a very interesting meeting, the two of them, and their dynamic together, that they were learning together, and their sort of flirtatious dynamic, even though they were definitely not a couple off screen, gave the viewers a way in to understand the changes that were happening in that community. And it also showed that something very different was happening in Bedford-Stuyvesant than these newspaper articles that were so bent on showing the decay and the poverty and the extreme negative conditions. And instead, we see families sticking together and young kids graduating from boys' high school speaking about their future at Harvard University and speaking about how they want to come back to the neighborhood and make changes. And we see parents very hopefully pushing their children in strollers in the park and in the opening credits, really excited about what the future might bring. So it's an incredible counter narrative to other images of Bedford-Stuyvesant at that time.
I mean, when you think about, I mean, particularly how you frame Bed-Stuy, I mean, Bed-Stuy in the 1960s is what the South Bronx becomes to this discourse in the 1970s. And when you think about whether it's Inside Bedford-Stuy or Say Brother or Black Journal or particularly Soul, I mean, they're all based on a certain kind of interventionist models, you know, where you have these producers and artists who have an opportunity to produce media that really challenges the public perception of what Black culture is and what Blackness is and who Black people are. Could you talk a little bit about that early run of Black Journal in terms of its significance, you know, in terms of thinking about this moment in Black Power television?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the idea of coalescing a national show was really exciting because so many individuals in Black communities, from Watts to Bedford-Stuyvesant to Detroit, were very interested in learning about what was going on in other Black communities. And as other folks like Adam Green have really written about and I think supported in their scholarship, this is this time where you know, local Black communities are coalescing into this idea of a national African American identity. And what Black Journal did, because they could be truly a national show, and they did fly to California, and they also were international with you know, an office in Africa, is bring some of those things together and actually showcase what was happening, different really innovative solutions, for example, that were happening at a community level in specific cities, so that their audience could really get a sense of a national conversation that was happening in many different places. And so those places could start to talk to one another in ways that would have been hard to accomplish outside of a mediated environment like this. So that was really an exciting thing. And also the Black Journal staff, the fact that they were able to bring in, after their initial protest, they initially started out with a white executive producer. And when they struck to overthrow, which no one expected them to do, right? They were supposed to be grateful as hell to get on television, you know, to get their national show. And most of these folks came, you know, were outsiders to television. And so, you know, the NET was shocked that they would have the audacity within 5 episodes to go on strike and to call Variety and the New York Times and say, hey, we're walking out. That wasn't what was expected, right? And so for them to demand and to have that visible national show go on strike so early on and demand that they bring in a Black executive producer and to train Black crew members to go out into communities was also just incredibly exciting. And they were a beacon for other shows. So there were shows around the country that were keeping an eye on what was going on with Black Journal. And as I write about in the book, there's also a lot of staff members moving around, especially folks from Say Brother did come down to New York, some of them to work on Black Journal and other things. So there's also a real dialogue going on between some of the local shows and this national.
And it's important, right? WNET is really the flagship channel for what becomes PBS Channel 13 in New York, as it is still today. And so it was important that that kind of politics played out in that particular space, that particular landscape. You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Chicago-based media scholar Devorah Heitner, talking about her new book, Black Power Television, which is just published by Duke University Press. You know, if there's one of these television series that folks have really been interested in, and there continues to be an interest in finding out what the true legacy of the show is, it of course is Soul.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit about what was really this remarkable coming together of artists and conversation? I mean, there are just some legendary programs, you know, that have been associated, you know, when you have a openly gay host who's sitting down with the head of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, to have very real conversation about what homophobia looks like in the Black community in the early 1970s, right? We can't even really have that conversation in 2013. Talk a little bit about this legendary show.
Soul is incredible, and Soul is one of those programs that you could rebroadcast today and it would have a huge audience because the music on that show and the art on that show was so revolutionary. And as you say, the politics were so ahead of their time. I mean, I write about in the book that conversation between Farrakhan and Ellis Hazlip, and also Nikki Giovanni and her 2-hour conversation with James Baldwin, which touched on gender issues in Black families, talked about marriage and her choice not to be married, his life as a gay man and an author, and their mutual admiration for one another and their resistance to heteronormativity, really. I mean, that, and to have that conversation again, yes, on the air in 1970 was an incredible thing. One of my favorite quotes, I mean, I have so many favorite moments from these programs, but one of my favorite quotes of all time from watching these shows, where I literally just sat in the archive, stunned into silence, was seeing Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin talking, and she says, our audiences are going to want to know about homosexuality, and he says, love is love, babe, and if you duck it, you die. And you just think about, I mean, on television in 1970, like, no one was saying anything like that. I think some of the folks who worked on the shows were surprised that I focused so much on what I thought of as a real challenge to heteronormativity and feminism too of the show, not just the queer issues that the show brings up, but the feminism. Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni and Miriam Makeba and other incredible feminist artists performing their work and really critiquing some of the kind of rising norms of Black masculinity that some aspects, some corners of the Black Power movement were really pushing, and coming back at those in really interesting ways. And then you see other artists espousing those on the show, on some other episodes. So there's really a space for this incredible dialogue. And I think some of the folks who worked on the show were surprised that I focused so much on that, because they didn't necessarily see the show as being as much about gender. A lot of them just saw it as being about great art. But one of my arguments would be that, the great art coming out of the Black arts movement at that time, that gender and sexuality were one of the really major subject areas that keeps coming up in poetry and visual art, in theater. So you have people in film, like you have people like Cicely Tyson on the show talking about her decisions about her hair. And again, now we think of the sort of the politics of hair as being a topic that has been discussed and has been addressed, but at that time, not that we're done thinking about it, but it's definitely been thought about more. But in that moment, for her to really bring up that issue and have a deep discussion of it on the air, and to see the studio audience, which was such a crucial part of the show, literally leaning forward in their chairs, because this was a vital interest to them. And I argue in the book that they were modeling how to respectfully listen to these artists, how to listen to someone like Miriam Makeba on the show talking about how she'd been treated in the United States. And to say, again, on the show, one of those other moments where I just stopped, in just utter disbelief and excitement when Miriam Makeba says on Soul, that I always say the only difference between the United States and South Africa is that in South Africa, they admit what they are.
Wow.
And then she just stops. And the audience, you can hear the audience suck in their breath. And so I think that studio audience created a very different environment on Soul than the other shows, because it was this theatrical experience. It
was interactive, right? In a way.
Yeah, it was interactive. And those folks were modeling, how do I listen? So for folks at home who may not have known, and I think for some people watching, certainly for white audiences and other folks for whom this Black art stuff was really out of their comfort zone, out of any day-to-day experience they might have ever had, having that studio audience, I think, was helpful for them, like in a pedagogical way, like, oh, this is how I listen, this is what I do.
It makes you wonder how that show would have played out in the Twitter era, that it would have been the kind of show that folks would have been tweeting about all the time in many ways. The last show that you talk about, Boston-based Say Brother, and let me take a moment to give a shout out to Jewel Gomez, who personally is one of my favorite writers. Her collection of essays, 43 September, has had a tremendous impact on me. I've had the opportunity to teach her Gilda stories many times. And so the idea that, there's a story of Jewel Gomez that starts when she's a teenager working on this incredible show like Say Brother. I mean, talk about Say Brother in the universe of these other Black Power TV era shows.
Absolutely. Well, Boston, again, is every community is different, right? Boston is a city that has a very racist history and a very kind of openly racist history in some ways, and Black communities are very marginalized there. And so when Jewel was recruited to the show as a young college student, and they were recruiting these co-op students from Northeastern, she didn't even know that they were talking about a television show, right? She thought when they said program to her, she thought they were going to be giving out cheese. This is a story I have in the book, and that we just did an event together in San Francisco at the public library, and she said, I was a welfare kid, and when they said program, I thought they meant, here's your cheese. And so when she got to the studio to see what it was this incredible awakening of, this question of what would a Black show look like. And I think at Say Brother, more than even many of the other shows around the country that I've had the privilege to see, because they recruited so heavily from theater and they had folks like Stan Lathan and other people who were coming either from theater and television or other art backgrounds, what a Black show could look like became very aesthetically innovative right away. Yeah. And they had some money. And GBH also was a really central early producer of national public television shows. So again, Say Brother becomes one of these landmark shows because they did have a budget and they could go off site and they did have, a sizable crew and some really brilliant ideas. However, they also faced really harsh repression and censorship at different times from GBH. And so, when they went out and shot an uprising in the midst of happening in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and they chose to air an uncensored episode where people, in the streets in New Bedford, in the midst of an urban uprising, were swearing and cursing while they're giving their interviews. They chose to air that unedited, and it was, they initially lost their show, right? That was taken off the air and then came back due to protests. So there were things like that happened later in an episode that criticized a WGBH funder was pulled. So it criticized Polaroid, which of course Polaroid was making the IDs that Black South Africans were forced to carry. And so their complicity in apartheid was critiqued on the show, and that episode disappeared. Right, it's gone. No one will ever see that episode, so it was lost. I think in Boston, folks in places like Roxbury felt so invisible that seeing their neighborhood, even in the opening theme of the show, was incredibly powerful. And also, Boston was in some ways, a small city that direct activism had a lot of impact. So every time they would threaten to take the show off the air, people would actually march down physically to the station at WGBH, and that would have an impact, right? And they would, keep the show on the air. So that was an incredible aspect of being a local show in a small city, with a Black community that felt very invisible previously. They were not going to let that show go. People felt very strongly, and they also felt very strongly about the crew. And so when the crew rolled into New Bedford during that uprising, they were protected, they were sheltered, they were fed. People knew who they were at a very intimate level. So Jewel and Stan Lathan and Hazel Bright, the other folks I've interviewed from Say Brother, all talked about just being recognized in the community, in a relatively small city, walking down the street and having people know they're from Say Brother, and that was a really special experience. Another thing about Say Brother is that it's in a city with all of these universities at a time where a record number of African Americans are going to college, and many are the first in their family. So for all these young people at Northeastern, at Brandeis, at Harvard University, there's a lot going on, right, with students. And so UMass, all of these students are in this place. And so that's documented. And what was really fun about Say Brother is they're also bringing high school kids into the studio, and high school students were hosting news. So the old people on the show were the college students working there, and the young generation were the high school news reporters. It's a very youthful perspective, that show.
You've been watching Left of Black. We've been joined via Skype by Chicago-based media scholar Devorah Heitner as we talk about insurgent Black media from the Black Power era. She's the author of the new book, Black Power Television, published by Duke University Press. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Devorah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, all black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, say. All black everything. All black, all black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos.